All right, so today we're diving into H.R. 7343. It's a bill that's already stirring up plenty of debate in the House, and now it's the Senate's turn to try to make sense of it. We're talking about immigration law enforcement, the whole nine yards, and our mission, as always, is to break it all down, figure out what it could really mean for you.
So this bill is it's a bit of a hot potato, isn't it? I mean, the name itself, Detain and Deport Illegal Aliens Who Assault Cops Act. It's certainly grabbing people's attention.
Yeah, it's not exactly subtle, is it? But something tells me there's more to unpack here than just a catchy title. Is it even accurate, or is it exaggerating a little to make a point?
It does capture the general idea behind the bill, but like with a lot of laws, the real story's in the details. For instance, one of the things this bill wants to do is actually amend the existing Immigration and Nationality Act. Add a whole new category for detaining immigrants. And the focus is on anyone who has been charged with, arrested for, convicted of, or admit to acts constituting assault of a law enforcement officer.
Okay, so they're creating this whole new basis for detention centered around the idea of assault. But here's the thing, assault, that's a pretty broad term, right? I mean, accidentally bumping into someone on the street versus, a full-on attack. Technically, both of those could be called assault.
Exactly. And that's where things get interesting, because the bill itself, it doesn't actually specify what level of assault we're talking about. And to make it even more complicated, it uses whatever definition of assault is on the books in the place where the incident supposedly happened.
Wait, so what qualifies as assault in one state could be totally different from another state?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that's what has people worried, because it creates this situation where something that might be a minor offense in one place could have huge immigration consequences for someone in another.
So even a relatively small altercation, something that might not even land someone else in serious trouble, could mean detention for someone under this bill.
That's the potential impact here.
Yeah.
And it all comes down to how broadly assault is being defined and applied.
Yeah.
Which, as you can imagine, is a pretty big deal.
No kidding. That's a lot of power riding on a single word. And it makes you wonder, how often could things go wrong depending on who's interpreting that word?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it leads us to another layer of this whole thing. The bill isn't just about any assault. It has to be against a law enforcement officer. But even that term, well, it's not as clear-cut as you might think.
So we're talking about this huge range of actions that could be assault under this bill. But then who exactly are we talking about when we say law enforcement officer? Because I have a feeling that's another term that's ripe for interpretation.
Oh, you'd be surprised.
Yeah.
It's actually way broader than a lot of people might think. It's not just your typical police officers. We're talking firefighters, first responders, even campus security folks. Those school resource officers you see around. They're all covered under this bill's definition.
Wow. So anyone with some authority on a school campus at the scene of an accident or a fire? That's a lot of people.
And it gets even more, let's say, complicated.
Okay.
Because the bill goes on to say the assault has to occur while they're on the job, engaged in the performance of his or her official duties, or even because of their position.
Wait, hold on. Because of their position. So, hypothetically speaking, of course, if an off-duty officer gets into an argument at the grocery store, could that somehow be seen as because of their position, even though they're not technically working at that moment?
That is the million-dollar question, my friend. And unfortunately, the bill itself doesn't give us a clear answer. It's one of those gray areas that lawyers will be arguing about in court for years if this thing passes.
This official duties thing feels like a legal landmine waiting to explode. I can already picture the lawsuits piling up. But, okay, let's say for argument's sake that someone is accused of assaulting an officer who's definitely on duty. No question about it. What happens then? What does this bill actually aim to do with that person?
Well, that's where the whole detain and deport part comes in.
Yeah.
The bill says that Homeland Security, they're obligated to issue a detainer for anyone who fits that description.
Wait, obligated to, meaning it's not even optional. We're talking mandatory detention here, even if the person hasn't been convicted of anything in court yet.
You got it. A detainer is basically a way for immigration authorities to hold someone while they investigate, regardless of whether or not they've actually been found guilty in a court of law.
Let me get this straight. Someone could be accused of a relatively minor offense, and we're working with a pretty loose definition of assault here, and they could end up detained, potentially even deported, all without a trial.
You're catching on. And keep in mind, this is all happening within a system where immigrants already face an uphill battle.
Yeah.
And navigating legal processes, language barriers, getting access to legal representation. So the stakes are incredibly high.
We've talked about detention, but this bill doesn't just mention detaining folks, right? It's the Detain and Deport Act. So does that mean if someone is detained under this bill, deportation is automatic? Is that a done deal at that point?
Not exactly.
Yeah.
It's not quite that cut and dry. Think of it this way. Being charged under this bill could definitely put someone on a faster track to deportation, especially with how complicated immigration law already is. But this bill by itself doesn't automatically mean you're getting deported.
Okay, so it's more like it adds to the possibility. It makes deportation more likely, but not a guaranteed outcome just from this bill alone.
Right. This bill is really focused on that initial detention.
Yeah.
Getting immigration authorities involved right away. If things were to move towards deportation, that would usually involve a whole separate set of legal procedures and would depend on a bunch of factors, not just this one charge.
Got it. So an added layer of complexity for sure, but not necessarily a one-way ticket out. Speaking of adding layers, I noticed this bill also wants the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, to do a study. It almost feels like Congress is saying, hold on, maybe we need a little more information before we put this into action.
It's true. The bill specifically asks the GAO to look into how many immigrants have been detained for assaulting law enforcement officers over the past 5 years.
So they want the data. Interesting. It makes you wonder if this is really addressing a widespread problem that needs this kind of legal change, or if it's, I don't know, maybe a solution in search of a problem.
That's the question, isn't it? And hopefully that GAO study will shed some light on what's really going on.
Well, there you have it, folks. A bill that aims to detain immigrants accused of assaulting law enforcement officers, but with a very broad definition of what assault even means, and a pretty wide range of who qualifies as a law enforcement officer. And then on top of all that, this whole thing hinges on the idea of official duties, which just seems like a recipe for confusion and court battles down the road.
And let's not forget, this bill has already made it through the House. It's on the Senate's plate now.
It'll be interesting to see what happens next. This bill really highlights those big ongoing debates we see playing out about immigration, about law enforcement, and about what justice really means. It's a lot to process, and it's definitely something to keep an eye on. And for all of you listening, here's a little something to think about. This bill specifically focuses on immigrants' raters. But what if there was a similar piece of legislation aimed at U.S. citizens? How would that change the conversation? What kind of implications would that have on our rights and freedoms? Something to consider as we all try to make sense of this thing. Thanks for diving into this with us.